All right, here we go. As promised, we are joined by the host of Reality Check and the managing editor at MRC TV, Brittany Hughes. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me. I love being here.
Great. Hey, you know what? I've been going through not only some of your stuff there at MRC TV, but obviously it has not exactly been a slow news cycle over the last 5 to 7 days. I'd love to go through this little. I've got a mini pile here of news stories, and just sort of on a subject by subject basis, kind of get your thoughts. You ready to go?
Fire away.
Fantastic. Let's do this. Number one on most people's list, especially over the last 48 hours, is the Supreme Court and the upholding the Trump travel ban. From a realistic standpoint, what did that decision accomplish? And is there any explanation as to why this suddenly is something that's being put on a par with the KKK and Nazis and other things like this? How do we go from 0 to 1,000 like that?
Because the left has lost their minds. And I think you've seen that over the past couple of weeks when it comes to things like immigration. I mean, look, you disagree with the left on any policy issue at this point, and you're immediately a Nazi. You're basically Hitler. And it kind of loses its punch after a while when that's their response to everything. Here's the thing about the so-called travel ban, all right? It limits on various bases the people who can travel from 7 different countries, okay? And it's different for each country. Some of them restricts people who are coming across to immigrate, so people who are coming across to stay permanently. Others, it restricts more broadly. It depends on it's country by country. But it includes 5 Muslim-majority nations, Venezuela, and North Korea. And it's because the State Department has said that these are countries that are at higher risks of terror infiltrations. And by the way, these are the same countries that were on the Obama administration's list that they wanted to restrict travel from, but you don't hear about that part because, this is all about hating President Trump. And so what the Supreme Court essentially did yesterday was they upheld that the president does have the constitutional right to limit travel into the United States. That's what the Supreme Court ultimately said. As long as he does not infringe on the Constitution in some other way, in doing so, he has the power to do exactly what he's doing. The reason that the left is freaking out is because they want to label this as a Muslim ban because it's a good way to call him a racist. It's not a Muslim ban. Only 5 countries on this list are Muslim-majority nations. There are about 50 Muslim-majority nations in the world. This restricts travel on various bases from about 1/10 of those countries. Mm-hmm. So the vast majority of Muslims in the world can come to the United States just fine, obviously according to our policies, but they can come just fine. So to call this a Muslim ban is not only false, but incredibly, incredibly deceptive, a way to basically label him as Islamophobic. So that's what you're seeing happen on the left now. Is
it oversimplifying the subject to basically say, the ruling said, look, if you can't verify people, he's got the right, the president has the right to say, okay, we're going to back down on this, the immigration from this country. And the other thing is, it's got nothing to do with intent and what you're thinking between your ears as you're writing something. It's exactly what the law, what the bill, what the statement said. It's got nothing to do with something that you might be thinking.
No, and the other thing, too, that people need to understand is these countries, it's not just that we can't verify who these travelers are. It's that these specific countries lack systems in place to verify on their end. Mm-hmm. And so there's a partnership that has to happen between us and the sending country wherein they verify who their people are and they've got documentation, and that way we can verify who they are through their systems. These are countries that don't have those systems in place, or they have systems that don't go far enough and we're uncomfortable with them. So it's not just that, we can verify somebody from Afghanistan, but not Iran. It's that Iran does not have the system in place that allows us to verify those people. And we're saying until you get that under control and we know who you're sending, we're going to restrict travel because we don't know if this is a good person, if this is a bad person, if they mean to do us harm. That's why you're seeing certain countries on this list and not others.
All right. And something else in that Supreme Court decision that for some reason hasn't gotten much coverage, that it was included or even mentioned in that decision. One of the, I guess, sort of blights on the reputation of our country was back in the 40s. There was a Supreme Court decision called Korematsu versus USA, and it had to do with the Japanese American citizens, the Japanese Americans that were put in internment camps. And this decision, as part of that yesterday by the Supreme Court, it didn't overturn it, but it rejected the whole idea of Korematsu versus the USA. Why aren't more people making a big deal out of that? Because that really separates a lot of these things when it comes to immigration and it comes to even your own people, that rightfully so, we need to separate and push back and get away from as much as possible.
A lot of times people, that's the problem, though, is they don't want to separate it. It's the same thing, if I can make a comparison here, it's the same thing that you've seen with immigration over the last couple of weeks, where if you say that we have a detention facility that is holding people and holding families because we're trying to figure out who they are and whether they have a reason to stay in the United States, well, if you take an aerial shot of a detention facility and it's got a roof and a barbed wire fence, well, now all of a sudden it's Auschwitz, and the border agents are basically the Gestapo, and these are basically concentration camps. I mean, we've literally heard these places compared to concentration camps simply because they are detainment facilities. They are not concentration camps. We're not gassing people or working them to death or beating them to death. They're not emaciated. It's ridiculous. And anybody who's ever picked up a history book would understand that.
Yeah.
But, there's this quick comparison being made with the travel ban to policies that we had in World War II that have since been ruled, unconstitutional, and the fact that they happened is egregious and is a black mark on our history. But in hindsight, looking at it in hindsight. But this is nothing close to Japanese internment camps. This is nothing close to what we did back then.
I agree.
And to say so is to be ignorant of history, but they're not looking at the facts. They don't want to understand it that way. Yeah. They want to make a quick apples to oranges comparison.
Brittany, those were Americans. They happen to be of Japanese. Absolutely. They happen to be of Japanese heritage, but those were Japanese Americans. We, FDR and the American government, put those people in internment camps. Yes. This wasn't illegal immigrants.
And that's exactly the difference. I mean, well, one of the many differences. But people, again, the left is not looking to see that. The media is not looking to see that. There's no understanding of, okay, look, this really is an apples and oranges comparison. These two things are not the same. It's a quick and easy label to slap on. It becomes a nice little catchphrase in order to make Donald Trump look like a giant racist and to make all of his voters look like giant racists. That's the end goal here. It's not to ferret out the facts. It's not to actually have an understanding of what's going on. It's to brand him with certain labels to make him seem xenophobic, like he hates people from other countries, like he hates people with other skin colors, and so do all of his 63 million plus voters. They're all a bunch of racists. And this, I think, is something that is it would be fascinating to watch on the right if it weren't so sad and so terrifying. This idea that a large segment of our country has completely neglected facts and completely thrown out, logical thinking in order to buy into a narrative where they've come up with their conclusion, and then they formulate a hypothesis that fits it. Is what we're seeing here. And I think that does a huge disservice because this is not a Muslim ban at all. And if you understood how many Muslim countries there are in the world, that would be very easy to see. That's not a partisan thing. Yeah. That's just a fact. Yeah,
if you're going to do that, Indonesia would be pretty close to the top of that list, and they are not on that list. Mm-hmm. Hey, my former state, they might be onto something here. I'd love to get your thoughts on a news story that hit the other day. California it's been proposed out there, a state bill. It's a 1424 to the California Senate They would like to form a government-run group to monitor fake news. What could possibly go wrong with this?
So I live out here in California, not for very long, actually. My husband is in the military, so we're out here. And it's been an eye-opening experience for sure, I will tell you. And this is just the latest in a bunch of wacky things that California has decided to push. There's no saying that it's going to pass necessarily. It's sitting in the Senate right now, the state Senate. But it is a bill that would mandate that the government create a fake news advisory board. So essentially a public-private partnership where you have a board that would then come up with definitions of fake news. They're supposed to study what is fake news and come up with a plan to stop it on social media sites. So, of course, a lot of these social media sites are based out of California. You got, Facebook and Google and all. And so what could possibly go wrong with the government getting involved in determining what is and isn't fake news and what should and shouldn't be disseminated? It's not like we've ever seen that before in human history, and it's ended terribly. Yeah. Oh, wait, yes, it has. It's also interesting to see who they want to put on this panel. They've got heads of social media.
But Brittany, realistically, isn't this one of those subjects that you look at? Your common sense side of your brain goes, you know what, that is a good idea. We do need something. But then you start looking at it, you start looking at implementing that, and it's like 1984 Big Brother, and everything else just drips off of it.
Well, so you do need something, and I can tell you exactly what you need. You need an educated populace that can understand information and can think for themselves. That's what you need. You need people to go back to a time when people had gray matter between their ears and didn't necessarily believe something just because Freedom Eagle Facebook told them, or because their grandma told them, or whatever. So if you had a populace that actually cared to learn, and I think a lot of us do, you wouldn't have so much of this problem. What we don't need is government intervention. There's a big difference, and here's one of the biggest problems that I have. This idea that every time there's an issue, every time there's a problem that we need to solve, that it's the government's job to solve it. That is not true. Oftentimes when the government steps in to solve a legitimate problem, they end up just creating 5 more problems. So I do think that fake news is something that should be addressed in our society. I don't trust the government to do it. And I think that creates a whole lot of incentive for the government to be able to come in and to manipulate what they do and don't want people to hear, and what they do and don't want people to believe. The other issue that you have that a lot of free speech organizations are now saying about this California bill is that regardless of whether or not a piece of news is fake, it could be as fake as the day is long. But you start having free speech issues come into play when the government comes in and says you can't say that because it's incorrect. Well, our Constitution doesn't have a clause for whether or not information is correct or not. It simply says that you have free speech. So for the government to crack down on something just because it's fake, it being fake isn't necessarily a good thing, obviously, but it's not within the government's purview to come in and say you can't say it because it's fake.
Yeah, that it's the definition of a can of worms.
It's a huge can of worms. And, and they did try to pass a bill that was similar to this before. They tried to pass a bill that actually would have required schools to teach students the difference between real and fake news, and that failed, thank God, because, then, of course, you're funneling it through their little indoctrination centers. That's also terrible. Well,
that's basically what schools are these days. Along those lines, what'd you think of that, the congressional intern, the congressman from New Hampshire, whose intern screamed, basically, it starts with F and ends in U, to President Trump when he was at the Capitol last week? Yeah, I mean, they disciplined the hell out of her. She got suspended for a week.
She did get suspended for a week. So, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by this, because we have, as you've seen with, the whole Maxine Waters situation this week, you have a complete and total breakdown of civility and decorum in this country in a way that I don't remember seeing. This intern, there was a cell phone footage taken of her basically screaming "F you" at President Trump as he walked into a meeting. I believe he was meeting with Paul Ryan and a couple of other folks on immigration. And she got suspended for a week. It doesn't surprise me that somebody would scream that in the halls of Congress these days, sadly. I will say, had this been an intern for a Republican lawmaker and had that been President Obama walking through, the reaction would have been completely different. First of all, it would have gotten a lot more media coverage than it did. And she probably would have been branded a racist and every kind of phobia under the sun just simply for saying those words. And she would have been fired. The fact that she was just suspended tells me a lot about if you don't like Donald Trump, whatever, if you don't respect Donald Trump, whatever, a lot of people don't, but he is the president of the United States. That is, the office of the president commands a certain amount of respect regardless of who's sitting in the Oval Office. And it tells me a lot about how the left side of the aisle in Congress thinks about that office at all when they're willing to have one of their interns scream something foul right there in the halls of Congress at the president to his face, and they just suspend her for a week. That tells me a lot. And it tells me that they probably wouldn't have suspended her if there hadn't been at least a small outcry. If nobody had made a big deal out of it, she probably wouldn't have gotten anything at all.
Or a cell phone video. If there's no video,
or a cell phone video.
It didn't happen. If it didn't in a selfie or a cell phone video these days, it didn't really happen.
Exactly. It's kind of the tree that falls in the forest. Fortunately, we do have cell phone footage, so we can see a lot of things that happen, which, it's both a good and bad thing depending on how you look at it these days. But
well, you mentioned Maxine Waters and her little riff, and I've got a little something on that later on. But it has ratcheted up people's feelings. And last time you were on, we sort of discussed, the whole thing that everything goes from 0 to FU in like nanoseconds when it comes to a conversation. But now you're seeing things that are different. These confrontations, these literally getting into people's faces, getting into their space, if you will, personal space. And then there was actually an incident, a burnt headless animal carcass left on a DHS official's porch. Something like this happens when you've got elected officials out there actually encouraging people to confront and not saying violence, but do you really have to explain it to them? After the whole Steve Scalise thing, don't you know that people escalate and interpret things pretty differently?
Well, I think the fact that we just commemorated just a couple weeks ago the 1-year anniversary of that congressional baseball game where Steve Scalise almost lost his life, I think is not lost on a lot of people. Look, we've had contentious times in American history before. I'm 29 years old. I barely remember the Clinton years myself, but I remember my parents getting into heated discussions with people over, Clinton versus Bob Dole and things like that. But it wasn't like what it is today. I don't remember a time. Well, I mean, you always had your crazies. You always had your people on the fringe of both parties who did wackadoodle stuff. And when they did it, the rest of the party would come out and be like, oh, well, we reject that and that's bad. And people weren't widely calling for violence. Now, though, you have a media that is intentionally whipping people into a frenzy, and they'll use fake news to do it. They'll use fabricated photos of crying toddlers at the border and make up stories about them if it means getting people all hyped up with anger and hatred and emotion. You can't be a political pundit and sit there on national television and call Donald Trump Hitler and say that he's putting people in concentration camps without knowing what you're doing. You have liberal lawmakers like Maxine Waters standing there and essentially saying whenever a member of the Trump administration steps out their front door, harass them until they can't stand it anymore. Don't let them go to gas stations and grocery stores and restaurants. I mean, this is no longer just simply let's disagree with one another. We can even get heated about it. But then at the end of the day, we all share the same oxygen and go about our lives. This is encouraging And you can't encourage harassment without encouraging violence. I'm sorry. This idea that, well, I'm encouraging people to get in somebody's face, but not necessarily to take a swing at them. Well, that's what happens when you rile up a mob and tell them to go harass someone. Eventually it escalates into violence.
Yeah.
That almost always happens. So to say, well, I'm not encouraging violence, well, yes, you are. That's exactly what you're doing. And the left is doing it. It's their media, it's their politicians, it's their op-ed writers, it's celebrities in Hollywood. I mean, you just had Peter Fonda, and I get it. He's a crackpot. He probably doesn't speak for every Democrat on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a guy who clearly had no fear when he suggested that DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen be stripped naked and publicly whipped, and that Donald Trump's 12-year-old son be put in a cage with child rapists. I mean, this is the thing that the man actually said. We've gone beyond. I heavily disagree with you. Yeah. This is why you're wrong.
Well, on the same
out insanity.
But Brittany, along the same lines, and I've got to get going here. But when people say their immediate comeback is the words and the statements and the tweets of the president as a rationalization as to why people do things like this, is there a cause and effect in your mind between what Trump does, what Trump says, and how people react?
So I have long since held that I am not a fan of how the president tweets and a lot of the things that he said. He was a little cringeworthy on the campaign trail. I think he's toned down a little bit on certain things since actually taking the office. But he does. He is a loose cannon when it comes to how he tweets and the things that he says, and I don't agree with a lot on that side either. But I will say this. As much as the president has said a lot of things that I disagree with and has said a lot of things in ways that I disagree with, and you can correct me if you've seen something that I haven't, but I don't recall him standing there and telling people to every single time, some Democrat steps out of their house, I want you to make them fear for their life and make them, run and hide and be afraid to send their children to school because you're going to harass the mess out of them all day long. I don't recall that. I will also say this. Look, if the president says something that makes you that viscerally angry and your immediate response is to go start being violent, that says just as much, if not more, about you than it does about him. Yeah, you have the choice of whether or not you're going to go be violent.
Try yoga and meditation.
Yeah, exactly. Just woosah, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and maybe have a drink. It's going to be okay.
Hey, Brittany, thank you so much for joining me. Fantastic stuff, and I look forward to talking again.
Thanks for having me. I'll be back anytime.
Thanks, Brittany.